tonight to discuss an article in the January 2014 issue by Dr. Georgia Purdom, and she's here to answer questions of our readers about the Galapagos Islands. Georgia, for those of you that aren't aware, is a speaker and researcher for Answers in Genesis, earned her doctorate from Ohio State University in molecular genetics, and spent 6 years as professor of biology at Mount Vernon Nazarene University. So, Georgia, before we even get started answering questions, and we have several, we've got over a dozen questions so far. And by the way, before we begin, any of you that are watching or able, we will take more questions as well. The email was authorchat, that's one word, authorchat at answersmagazine.com. So email me at any time, and I'll have it up on my screen, and we'll be asking our questions also as they come in. So, but before we begin, Georgia, would you tell us a little bit about the history that led to this article? And I know that a book's involved as well.
Well, correct. And so in 2011, I visited the Galapagos Islands with a homeschool group from Atlanta, Georgia. And while I was there, it was just so amazing to me to see all the wonderful animals and plants and just the wildlife and the islands themselves. And it just really, for me, it was something that I wanted to write more about from a creation perspective, from a biblical perspective, because the islands are so associated with Darwin and evolution, and we know that's not true. We know those ideas are not true. So what about when we look at this from a biblical creation perspective? And so that was what encouraged me to not only write the book, but then also obviously the article for Answers Magazine based off of that.
On the magazine, the article itself in the book that you wrote, what's the primary audience that you had in mind, and what's the best way for them to use the book?
Well, you know, it was interesting when I was writing the book. There it is.
Plug, shameless plug.
So when I was writing the book, I really wanted my audience to be kind of broad. I definitely was writing it for Christians because I wanted them to be educated on these issues. But I also wanted non-Christians to be able to pick up the book and to gain a better understanding of the biblical creation view and how science that we have today confirms that. And also understand how that relates to the gospel, and that is also clearly presented in the book. So I really see kind of two audiences in mind, and I wanted people, you know, it's not just a coffee table book. You know, it has a lot of photographs in it, and it is very beautiful in that sense, but it also has a lot of content in it, and very, I think, short, easy to read little snippets, so to speak, that really give you more insight on these animals, the islands, the geology, the climate, and all those different aspects. So I think it can be very useful even for children, maybe in a homeschool setting. It can be useful for any parent who's really trying to educate their children about these issues, and hopefully to adults as well, just in maybe having opportunities to talk about these things among, you know, their friends, and just to gain a better understanding again of Galapagos and what it means to look at that from a creationist perspective.
Okay, before we start looking at a lot of the specific questions, I'll have a broad question here first. That's related to the thesis of your article itself, and if you could elaborate on that to begin with. That's where you talk about Darwin and you went to the same island. You see the same facts, but you came to different conclusions. Would you explain that a little bit first? Because I think that all of your answers to the most of the questions will relate to that.
Yes, and so and that's what I really wanted people to understand, was that, you know, the same birds, the same tortoises, the same islands. But Darwin and I observed the very same things. The difference was our starting points when we looked at those islands, because I started from the perspective that God's word is true from the very first verse, and that because God is eternal and He was there from the beginning, there in the past, that He knows the truth and He has inspired men to write that truth down, and we have that today in the Bible. And so that was a very different view than the view that Darwin took, that if God did exist, he didn't necessarily believe that He was a benevolent God, and he was buying into the idea of millions of years, that rock layers take millions of years to form, and those sort of principles about the past, and in doing so, starting to formulate those ideas of evolution by natural selection. So no God is needed. So we were looking at the same thing in the present, but we had very different views on what those things meant, because we had very different starting points about the past. So that's why I always say, you know, when scientists today, we're all looking at the same evidence, we're all looking at the same thing. The difference is our starting points when we look at those things, and then how the conclusions we draw about the past.
Okay, so the first question that I have specifically is, your article says no mechanism has been observed to change animals and plants from one kind into a completely different kind. Could you explain variation within created kinds a little more, and how this is not the same as evolution from a common ancestor?
Right, and so one of the things that evolution requires is a genetic mechanism to get from one kind of organism to another kind of organism. You have to have that, and I always say, you know, you can have all the time in the world, but if you don't have a mechanism to get from, say, you know, dinosaurs to birds, you don't have a way to gain new and novel genetic information of the type necessary for evolution, the gains of structures and functions, then you can't evolve. From one kind of organism can't evolve into another. So that's what you know, that's what we need to understand. And so when we look at the islands, we see them. We see that these animals, there's variation within the kinds, like Darwin's finches, you have variation among the finches. The tortoises, you have variation among them. But you certainly don't see the kinds of changes that are leading one kind of animal into a completely different kind of animal. Now, Darwin thought if you just give it enough time, that's what will happen. But again, you have to have that mechanism, and that's what you don't have. And so what we're merely seeing is consistent with the Bible and the historical science based off of that, which again is saying that God created animals according to their kind, and while we have variation or speciation within those kinds, we don't have evolution of the type going from one kind to a different kind.
Okay, well, a lot of these questions may have a little bit of overlap. I think the people watching this will understand because they're related questions. I have one from Todd, and he says, are evolutionary scientists still teaching that mutations are the driving force of macroevolution, especially when it's shown not to be the case? At least that was his statement.
Yes, and I had that question actually earlier today by someone else. You know, is it still mutations and natural selection? Is that still what evolutionists are saying is the cause of animals evolving over time? And yes, it is. They might call them slightly different things. They might vary a little bit, but when you go back to the root of what they're talking about, it's always mutation and natural selection as the driving forces for Darwinian evolution. And again, we can observe mutations, we can observe natural selection in the present. That's a type of what we would call observational science. We can observe it in the here and now. We can test it, repeat it, you know, observe it, all of those things. But that's very different from historical science, which is based on worldviews and based on ideas about the past and who is the authority, God or man. And so what we really see is that again, mutations and natural selection might allow variation within kinds, but they don't certainly allow one kind to become a different kind. So evolution hasn't changed as far as what they still think are the mechanisms, and therefore they don't still have an explanation for how evolution could occur.
Okay, I have another. Most of the questions are specifically about the process of speciation and evolution. This is from a molecular and cellular biology student, Joshua, and he asks, or he just listen for a second. He explains what he's hearing in his class and then asks the question. Similarities in natural selection-based survival are convincing arguments in favor of evolution in many classes. For example, an organism in the environment develops a mutation that allows it to feed better than others, which it allows it to survive better, reproduce, and possibly fix this change. Here he gets the question. The change necessary would have to be very advantageous, or else it would take a long time to become fixed and might simply lag behind as as an allele instead of replacing the other traits. Now, that's difficult language. You might want to explain for a second for younger watchers. But how do evolutionists answer this problem, and how best can we respond to their claim from both a genetic and organismal perspective?
Okay, boy, there's a lot of things in that. So it is problematic for evolutionists, and they realize that. There's, you not just have to get a beneficial mutation or a mutation that can supposedly move you from one kind of organism to another, but you have to fix it. In other words, it has to be a part of that population, of all the organisms in that population, then have that trait and continue to pass it on. And so that's what they call fixing it. And so, and that doesn't happen overnight. That takes a long period of time to fix a mutation in a population. So when you even look at the differences, say, between human and chimp genomes, and supposedly, according to evolution, humans and chimps shared a common ancestor, there's millions, and I mean hundreds of millions of differences between the two genomes. How do you fix that many millions of mutations in a very short period of time in which they think humans and chimps evolved from a common ancestor? I mean, it's very, very difficult to be able to do that. It just doesn't work from a genetic perspective. And so, again, they're always coming up with ways to try to get around that. But and one of the things I think that's interesting, too, is that people don't often think of is, they think about beneficial mutations, but and there are mutations that are advantageous in certain environments, but when not only does an organism inherit from its parents the good mutations, the beneficial mutations, it also inherits all the deleterious ones, all the bad ones. And so does that one good one that you might get, does it outweigh all the bad ones you're going to get? I mean, conservative estimates say that there's probably about 1 to 300 new mutations or new changes in the genetic information from one generation to another. That's conservative estimates. It may be actually higher than that. So how can these organisms, how can the good outweigh the bad, so to speak, when that's what's actually occurring, and that you're looking at the organism as a whole, not just, ooh, I got this beneficial mutation. It's, I got this whole genome, warts and all, so to speak, and have to deal with that. So it still becomes, and I think a lot of people don't think about it that way, but it becomes very problematic for evolution, and they just don't have really good answers for that.
Okay. I'm going to wait on this one question because I want to talk about, there's several questions about the actual interesting animals there. Let me ask first, I think my wife and I, this is by Jonathan and Veronica, my wife and I really enjoyed your article. In your travels to the Galapagos Islands, was there a particular creature that strongly pointed to a creator specifically because of a group of traits that could not have feasibly adapted separately or gradually, but would have had to be all expressed fully at the beginning in order for the creature to survive? So make it difficult for the evolutionists, like you said, fixing a set of traits.
Well, I think, and so one of the organisms that I was particularly just interested in was the marine iguana, because it is the only iguana in the world that goes into the water to actually get its food. And of course, their iguanas are cold-blooded. And so to go into what are, kind of cold waters there in the Galapagos to get food, to eat algae, is definitely not something you would expect. And you don't see it anywhere else in the world. But there's a lot of water, or there's a lot of food in the water in the Galapagos. There's not as much on the land, and so they've adapted and been able to do that. So, but what you see, they also have land iguanas there. So if you look at the difference between the marine iguanas and the land iguanas, you'll see that they have very similar traits. They're just expressed slightly differently in the two different organisms. So God has designed them to be able to adapt to different environments that are there. It's not that just, oh, God made them have these specific things, but that there's sort of a range of those things. Like, for example, marine iguanas have very long and sharp claws that allow them to hold onto the rocks when they're underwater so that they can eat the algae. Land iguanas don't have those long, sharp claws. They still have claws, but they're not long, and they're not necessarily sharp. Marine iguanas have the ability to sneeze out salt because they don't actually taken any fresh water, just seawater. And so land iguanas have the ability, have those areas, those special areas that are designed for that, but they're not underdeveloped. They're not as developed. So I think what we see is that how God has created these animals to be able to express different things under different situations to allow them to adapt in a post-fall and a post-flood world.
Okay, well, it looks like we have about 70 people that have joined us, and I just wanted to say again, if you have questions, and I'm getting some more, if you have questions, the email is authorchat@answersmagazine.com. I've gotten some questions about good mutations, but we'll get to that in a second. I want to finish another question related to the marine iguanas. So there's a suite or a combination of traits that it has that allows it to live well, and you're saying it's difficult for evolution to explain how these could arise and be fixed. Now, from our perspective, you alluded to in the article mediated design, and we got some questions for you to elaborate on that. In the article, in the magazine, you said, look at the book. But you have a little bit of time here to explain that for people that aren't familiar with that concept. Do you mind? There were some questions on that.
So with mediated design, we haven't worked out all of the specifics as to exactly how this occurs, but the idea is that God created the original kinds with all of the information that they would need to adapt to different environments, and then whatever environments they would be in. And so when they're in those conditions, somehow that environment affects the expression of those genes, or affects the expression of that information somehow in some way. We don't know, again, exactly how that works. One of the ways that I think that creationists really need to be looking at is actually the field of epigenetics, which is chemical markers that are actually on the genes that affect expression. And we know for a fact that those chemical markers are greatly affected by the environment. It could be by diet. It can be by other environmental things. And so it's really interesting to think about, well, maybe if they're in a certain environment, that affects the expression, these chemical markers, so that those genes are expressed in different ways, and then the organism has different traits as a result of that. Not something brand new, but just maybe an enhancement of a trait that it already had. And the nice thing about epigenetics is it's not a permanent change in the DNA. It's just it's not a change in the actual sequence. It's just a change in the chemical marker. So if the environment changes, then they can change back. Those traits can change then back to maybe what they originally were. So it allows that flexibility, so to speak, in the organism depending on the environment. So that's just one area that I think has become very interesting for creationists, and maybe understanding some of how mediated design might work.
Okay, well, one of the questions was, have there been any advances in the study of this triggering process? And I think I know what your answer is, but...
Not yet.
Not yet, okay.
Not yet.
So is that a problem for us? I'll just ask you that as the natural follow-up question as creationists and our ability to explain things from a biblical perspective.
I don't think it's a problem. I think it's just something that then needs to be researched. I mean, there are a certain number of us. We're very busy. Obviously, we're not getting NIH grants typically to do this type of study, so it is limited resources sometimes. Although that is, I think, slowly changing, especially as Christian colleges and the professors there take on these types of experiments and are wanting to look at these kinds of things. I think we're going to see a lot of advances in it, but I think it's just going to take time to have us then look at these things and really think about these things. Epigenetics is new even for those that are actively doing research with NIH grants and things like that. So it's a whole new area that we now need to think about and explore.
Yeah, well, you just get me excited because I heard about these things when we were working on the Creation Museum, and the evolutionists and in their research are finding things that help advance our understanding. So we're excited to see what they're learning, even though their goal is the same. Mm-hmm. That's my comment about it that I find interesting as an editor. All right, now, so some of the questions are related to to mutations and good mutations. I'll ask one of the questions, but I think in your answer you'll answer about 4 of the questions related to mutations, and if not, I'll ask some other ones. Here's, if natural selection as seen in Darwin's finches is actually a loss of genetic information, wouldn't that indicate that natural selection is not supportive of evolution as everyone believes, but actually one of the greatest evidences against it? Okay, there's different levels for you to answer that one, and I can repeat them if you need them.
Okay, so with Darwin's finches, the reason that we see a variation in the population there, is, as we explain in the book, has to do with the, a lot of it has to do with the change in beak size, and that's due to a difference in the level of expression of 2 different genes known as calmodulin and bone morphogenetic protein, BMP4. And so the different levels of expression of those genes leads to change the how long the beak is and how wide the beak is. And so in any given population, maybe on an island, you might have a variety of finches within that. When we were on one of the islands, you know, and we were looking at the finches, there were several different species there. So you always have this variety within that. Now, and during certain things like El Nino, which greatly affect the weather on the island and the food availability, you might get a shift in beak size, so that those that may be, and this is again just hypothetical here, but the idea is that they might, maybe you need birds with bigger beaks so that they can open harder seed pods and be able to get in and get the seeds. So it's an advantage to have a bigger beak. So those with the smaller beaks tend to die out and tend to get less, whereas those with the bigger beaks can survive and reproduce and have more. So you see a shift, but you always have some of the big beak and some with the little beak. Well, then maybe the situation changes, and now it's more advantageous to have a little beak. So then you get the smaller beaked finches becoming more populous than the larger beaked finches. But it's just an oscillation. You're not moving in a particular direction like evolution requires, sort of that vertical direction. Is just changing horizontally, and you're just getting sort of an oscillation, not really a movement in one particular direction. So Darwin's finches are a great example of that, and how we're observing natural selection in the present.
Okay, so there are the mutations. Some of these questions are saying there's no such thing as a good mutation, or they're all bad mutations. Can you talk about, are there some misunderstandings about mutations and what they can do?
Right. And
I'm interested too.
Yeah. So I normally, I kind of hedge away from saying the term beneficial mutations or good mutations, because it's always context dependent. It always depends on the context in which the mutation occurs. So a really good example of that is antibiotic resistance in bacteria. So in an environment like a hospital or a nursing home where there are a lot of antibiotics, it's advantageous for them to have a mutation that allows them to resist the antibiotic. So it's good in that particular environment. But if you would take those bacteria that are antibiotic resistant and put them in the soil outside your home, then in that context it's not good, because they're going to be there's always a trade-off, so to speak. So even though they can resist the antibiotic, it comes at a price. So now they can't break down maybe a certain nutrient as well, and they can't compete as well with other bacteria. And so that's why, and this is not medical advice, but I always say, you know, people that have these antibiotic-resistant bacterial infections, you know, what you need to do is go home and roll around in the dirt, right? Because the idea is, don't do that, okay? But the idea is that it needs to be competing with those good bacteria, because they'll outcompete it, because again there's a price to be paid for that mutation. So I always like to say that mutations are beneficial in certain environments. They have beneficial outcomes in certain environments, but overall they're not beneficial, because there's a swap, there's a price to be paid for that. And so can the organism pay that price? Bacteria can very easily, other organisms cannot.
Okay, now I know we're talking about the Galapagos Islands, but this is indirectly related, and I think we'll get back to the Galapagos. But on the bacteria, I had Candy ask a question, what about nylon-eating bacteria, which supposedly, quote, gained new information, end quote. Is that really the case? So let's take a case in point, and it's not something we find on Galapagos. But
Okay. Nope, you don't find nylon-eating bacteria there. Okay, so nylon-eating bacteria, yes, that's a classic example that you hear used a lot. And what you see is if you really look at the enzyme there, that the protein that's been altered to allow it to break down nylon, what it is the normal, let's see, well, it's been a while since I've looked at this, the normal substance that enzyme breaks down in that bacteria is very similar to nylon, okay, very, very similar. And so what happens is these bacteria have a mutation in the active site of that enzyme that allows them to break down the nylon as well as the regular substance, okay? So, but again, you have to remember, it was something that was already there, right? It's not a brand new protein. It's already there. The information was already there. It's just a slight alteration of that information to allow it to break down something that's really similar to what it already breaks down. So it's certainly not an example of something brand new that it's doing. So it's just not an example. And again, they're nothing other than bacteria that can now digest nylon. So that's certainly not an example of the types of changes you need for molecules to man evolution.
very good. Actually, that answered some other questions I was going to ask too. So coming back to the Galapagos and the iguanas, I'm fascinated by the swimming iguanas. I guess that means the marine ones that are native to the Galapagos. How different are they genetically from their land cousins?
Ooh, you know, I don't know that they have done any studies to actually look at that. So I read a lot of research papers several years ago in preparation for the Galapagos, and you do have to have a lot of special permits to study animals on the Galapagos because it is so protected. So some of the information that I would love to see just simply isn't available because people haven't done it. But what I can tell you is that marine and land iguanas can breed with one another and form hybrid iguanas. So they have a mixture of the traits of both the parents, and they have been observed there. But I don't know if they've looked specifically at the actual DNA there to compare it.
Okay, so I think this is real. So even if we can't, we know there are some differences somewhere. But there are two questions then as this relates to the evolutionary story. That is, how did these species get to the island, and why are they different? Let me go ahead and read both of them, and you can put together an answer related to both of them. As creationists, we believe, this is from Mark, as creationists, we believe God created all the genetic diversity on days 5 and 6. How then do we understand the apparent divergence of traits that exists only on the Galapagos Islands? And another email that just came in said, aren't some of the Galapagos animals similar to those on other South American islands? I was thinking it's continents, with minor differences due to isolated inbreeding. So now we've got the question of what we find on the islands, how Darwin interpreted it compared to the mainland, and then how we would.
Okay, so going back on the first question, while God created all of the genetic information in organisms on days 5 and 6, as far as animals go, he didn't create necessarily all the genetic variety there. The information is there, but things have happened over time, like mutations. Genetic changes have occurred that have led to some of that variety, led to probably quite a bit of that variety that we have today. So it wasn't all the information is there. It's not that, but it's just that not necessarily all the variety that we see today was existing right then and there on days 5 and 6 of creation. And then you'll have to remind me of the second question because that was kind of a lot to take in there.
Okay. The second question was, are some of the Galapagos animals similar to those on other South American islands?
Okay.
With minor differences due to isolated inbreeding.
Right, and so yes, there's a lot of interesting things going on the islands, and as we talk about in the book, probably a lot of these animals came there as a result of possibly rafting on debris that was there, possibly even several hundred years after the flood. People could have taken them to the islands. Obviously, birds can fly. So as far as getting them there, and they are very similar to the ones in South America, But as I think one of the authors pointed out, that some of the I think it was on the tortoises, that some of them are actually more similar to ones in Africa, which is really interesting, because then that's a long ways to come. And so how does that happen? And so we do think that the animals obviously have been able to migrate to the islands. And so, yes, what we would call, there's a couple different things like founder effect. So you have a very small starting population because only a few of them came from the mainland. So you only start with, say, let's just say hypothetically, with this one pair. And so when you start with just that one pair, you know, you're not necessarily going to get a huge amount of genetic variation. It may take a lot of time to get that because they are very isolated. There's no other ones to breed with them, so to speak. And we even see things like that happening on the islands, leading to speciation. For example, the Galapagos hawk, which I didn't talk about in the book, but there's I think it was on Hispaniola. They're actually starting to call it the Hispaniola hawk because they don't fly to other islands. They stay on that island, and so that population is constantly inbreeding, and so they're actually starting to speciate. Their DNA is starting to become, again, they're starting to have certain characteristics and traits that are specific for that island, and not found in other hawks. Again, not that it's drastically different things, but just minor variations that make them different. So it can definitely lead to that, and it is a factor with the animals on the Galapagos.
I want to ask just a couple of seemingly random questions. One person said, please make sure to ask this question. So I don't even have time to quite fully evaluate them, and just if they're short answers. This one is from a young person named Tyler. I think it's just a basic question he's asking for his background. How did the variation between sparrows disprove Darwin's theory of evolution?
Okay, so it's mainly finches on the island, not sparrows, but very similar. Okay, so you would see different types of variation. And because the types of differences that we're seeing among the finches aren't the types of changes that you need to go from, say, a dinosaur to a bird or one kind of organism to another. You're just getting small-scale changes that result in variation. And again, when we look at that at the genetic level, at the DNA level, those types of changes just don't occur that allow you to gain new and novel structures and functions to go from one kind to another kind.
Okay, and the next one is, would you agree with the following? At the level of the molecular information, which you may need to explain briefly, at the level of molecular information, there's no such thing as a good mutation. Every one of them destroys the existing genetic sequence information. In rare cases, there may be a phenotypic selective advantage in a specific environment, but there's never a creation of novel genetic information. And this is from Fred. So,
right, and that's just what I was describing with like antibiotic resistant. It may be beneficial in a given environment, but it's come at a cost. So they've also, because that particular protein has been effective that allows them to resist the antibiotic, it doesn't allow them to then break down a certain nutrient or take in a certain nutrient or something like that. So they've had to pay a price for that. And I have a chapter in the New Answers Book 4 on what about beneficial mutations, and I go into detail about several different types of mutations in bacteria, fish, and mammals, and to show how, again, people were always saying, well, you know, look, these are examples of evolution in action, but they're not a gain of new genetic information. They're an alteration of pre-existing information, which may be beneficial to an organism in a certain environment, but that's not the gain of novel genetic information that you need for evolution.
Okay. And another question I had, some of these sound technical and they're from people with college background and others are from high school. So is the DNA code able to detect the environment and change its expression during gestation? So I think that must be a follow-up to mediated design.
Well, I think it kind of goes to epigenetics because what happens... Okay. Yeah, so what happens is they've been able to, they know that a woman's diet affects her unborn child, okay? So when she's pregnant, depending on what her diet is, they've been able to show that that affects the expression of certain genes in her offspring, and not only does it affect that offspring, but can affect her grandchildren as well. So, and we don't know, it depends on which epigenetic study you look at. Some of them, they followed them for quite a while, and they're seeing that trait persisting. In other ones, they see it kind of fall off after a few generations. So you can imagine even different certain chemicals or toxins that people might be exposed to might change those chemical markers. They're looking at it in relationship to cancer, for example. So it might change those and cause a person to be more susceptible to that because of that.
And for our readers, actually, Dr. Purdom wrote an article on epigenetics that'll give you a little bit of background. I was going to look it up, but if you just type in a Google search epigenetics and Purdom, you should be able to find an article that'll give you some background on what they're finding. There's just a lot we don't know, and it's all exciting for us about the capability that God put into animals and plants. I am getting some good questions from several people, and appreciate them. From Gary, I hope he didn't mind me missing his name. He just asked a little easier question, a softball question. What was your most memorable thing about the island?
Woo, that's hard. You know, one of the experiences I have, actually, gosh, that's really tough. I remember one time, and this has to do more with astronomy, actually, than biology, but we were on the ship, on a cruise ship, basically between the two youngest islands, Fernandina and Isabella, and they are uninhabited islands. So here we are in the middle of the Pacific Ocean at night, and there's no light pollution because most of the islands are not inhabited, and you're in the middle of the Pacific, so you don't have any kind of light pollution. And when you look up, the stars are absolutely amazing. I mean, you can see so much, and it was just, and I thought, wow, here we are on this tiny boat in the middle of the Pacific, and yet we can see all these things that God has created for us to help let us appreciate. We seem so small, you know, compared to that, and yet God loves us and He cares about us, and that He gave us this wonderful creation to look at. So that was just one experience I can remember being really, really neat.